the distinction is these systems provide an interface for us to interact directly with AI systems, using it to produce new material, whether that's text or images or video. I want to underscore that the underlying techniques are best seen as more of a continuation than a radical break with prior forms of AI. But it has done something different in our public discourse because it's transformed AI from something that is invisibly used on us, as is the case with systems like facial recognition or automated decision-making, systems that we don't see, but that nevertheless impact our access to resources, our life chances. And it sort of changed AI into something that we now directly use. You know, your grandmother is playing around with ChatGPT at home. Having this material understanding of AI is important because it enables us to understand this present moment as an evolution of an existing market rather than the emergence of a novel one. Today's AI boom is driven at its core by commercial surveillance, and its incentive structures are shaped by the existing infrastructural dominance of a small handful of firms. This is what's driving the push to build AI and deploy it in the world at larger and larger scale, increasing the demand for resources that only big tech firms can provide and further cementing their considerable advantage. It's worth starting to then unpack the current landscape surrounding competition in AI with that material understanding in mind, because as you go down the stack of what it takes to build AI, there's concentration and monopolies at every layer. From the firms that make the chips at the bottom, design firms like NVIDIA, chip fabricators like TSMC, to those that run the cloud infrastructures like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, to those who amass large data sets through sprawling ecosystems like Google, Amazon, and Meta, and those who are training base AI models like Google, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, and some of these run through partnerships with firms like OpenAI or Anthropic. Now, there are a number of concerning trends that emerge from this picture of the market, and OMI's new report does a tremendous job of mapping these out. So now I'd like to turn it over to Max to walk us through them. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Sarah, for those really insightful remarks. Just to start off by introducing myself, I'm Max von Thun. I'm the Europe Director at the Open Markets Institute. So I'm based in Brussels, but despite the jet lag, it's great to be here with you all this morning to take part in this critical discussion on the future of AI. So I'm going to build on Sarah's points by going into a bit more detail about what concentration in AI looks like in practice, why that concentration is likely to be self-reinforcing over time, and some of the harms that are likely to come out of that concentration, indeed are already emerging from that concentration. And as Sarah mentioned, in doing so, I'll be drawing from our new report on AI and monopoly power, which we published today, and which you should be able to access using the QR codes that are scattered around the room, and which I'd encourage you all to read for more insights into our thinking. Can we move to the first slide, please? So let's start by talking about the AI supply chain, or the tech stack, which Sarah just mentioned, where at nearly every level of the technology stack, a tiny handful of corporations, often the very same ones, are completely dominant. So the first image that you see here is a really useful visualization of the AI supply chain, which we've borrowed from the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is an AI research organization based in the UK. And while in this case, we're looking at the supply chain for generative AI, most of these layers are applicable to market power in AI more generally. So if you take data, for example, which you see on the far left, which is one of the key inputs that you need to train an advanced AI model, the dominance of a few tech monopolies in areas including social media and search has allowed them over 2 decades, more or less, to collect and aggregate unprecedented amounts of data, often very personal and sensitive data on pretty much all of us in this room, which they can then use to train their AI models. And that experience has also made them more proficient than most at also collecting and organizing data from the wider open web, which, as we know, has been used extensively to train large language models, often without any permission. Or if you take computing power, another critical input for training AI models, NVIDIA, which designs the advanced semiconductors that underpin the most advanced AI models, and TSMC, who manufacture them in Taiwan, both enjoy market shares of around 90%, which is as close as you can get to being in a monopoly in the real world. And where the only competition that we're seeing in semiconductors is actually coming from other big tech firms, who rather ironically are quite unhappy about having to rely on a handful of chip monopolists. And if you go lower down the chain, the picture is largely the same, with just a few corporations owning the leading AI foundation models and the cloud platforms which host those models. So for example, in the cloud, just 3 companies, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, control around 2/3 of the global cloud market, and they face no serious rivals. And when it comes to foundation models, even though you do have some leading foundation models that aren't provided by the big tech companies, these players tend to be hugely dependent on the financial resources and the infrastructure of big tech, as we'll see a little bit later. Where you do see a bit more competition is at the application layer, where you have a larger amount of startups and entrepreneurs who are building applications on the basic infrastructure provided by the monopolists upstream. But the fact is that this diversity does very little to challenge the extreme concentration that we see upstream. And it leaves these smaller players almost completely dependent on the technological capabilities, on the technical decisions, and on the commercial strategies of the upstream players. And so what we're likely to end up with in terms of market structure is something that's worryingly similar to what we see today in e-commerce and in app stores, where sellers are entirely dependent on the infrastructure provided by companies like Amazon and Apple, and they're subject to the whims of those gatekeepers, whether that means handing over huge and growing amounts of their revenue and data, or being kicked off these platforms without warning. And in fact, we're already seeing early signs of the AI market moving in this direction. Just this week, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman said that his company had plans to launch a GPT store, which would allow developers to build applications on top of the basic infrastructure provided by OpenAI. And earlier this year, Amazon launched a service called Bedrock, which is designed to act as a gateway for our use of foundation models, not just Amazon's, but those of every company on the market. One other critical part of the picture, which isn't captured in this visual, is the role of monopoly power in other digital markets in reinforcing power in AI. So if you just think of the way that Google can use its dominance in search, for example, to steer users towards using its chatbot, or Meta's ability to do the same with its social networks. And this effect goes both ways. So we know that Amazon, for example, are using AI to strengthen their market power in the cloud, and Microsoft are doing the same in relation to Office software and other areas where it's already dominant. So this concentration in the supply chain means that anyone who wants to create a serious and competitive AI product finds themselves having to strike deals with the dominant gatekeepers. And these deals take a number of shapes, including partnerships, which usually involve access to the cloud computing controlled by the gatekeepers, direct investments, and sometimes outright acquisitions. We can go to the next slide, please. So the table you see in front of you, while not completely exhausted, captures many of the key deals that big tech has used to increase its control over AI in recent years. And while it would take me all day to go through them one by one, I think a couple of them are worth mentioning in particular. The first is Google's acquisition of a company called DeepMind back in 2014, which hugely expanded Google's advanced AI capabilities and also eliminated an important independent player from the market, and one that today would be likely to be a serious independent competitor to big tech. The second, of course, is Microsoft's huge investment in OpenAI. And while we don't know the exact terms, the investment is rumored to be worth up to $13 billion and gives Microsoft access to 3/4 of OpenAI's profits. And this arrangement works really well for Microsoft. It gives it privileged access to OpenAI's technological capabilities, huge influence over OpenAI's commercial and regulatory strategy, and on top of that, a very profitable cloud customer. But from a competition perspective, it's highly questionable. And most recently, Amazon and Google have both plowed up to $6 billion into Anthropic, who are one of the few non-big tech companies who are designing cutting-edge foundation models. And these deals, even when they aren't outright takeovers, are worryingly reminiscent of the notorious anti-competitive takeovers which helped a few tech giants monopolize digital markets in the past, from Facebook's takeovers of WhatsApp and Instagram to Google buying YouTube and DoubleClick. Can we go to the next slide, please? And if that wasn't bad enough, our view is that without intervention, this concentration in AI is highly likely to be self-reinforcing, as the illustration in front of you now shows. The basic logic here is simple. Those models trained on the most data and the most computing power will perform better than others, in turn attracting more users and generating more data and profits that can be plowed back into training those models even further. And as the combined impact of these network effects and economies of scale kick in, it will be harder and harder for anyone outside of big tech's orbit to seriously compete. And that's without accounting for monopolistic practices designed, for example, to exclude rivals or lock in customers, which, as we know, have been a chronic feature of digital markets in the past. So some of you might be asking yourselves now, so what? Why does this concentration in AI matter? As our report finds, there are a whole host of problems that monopoly power over AI presents us with, some of them already very real and some of them likely to emerge in the near future. Many, if not most of these, are amplifications of existing digital harms, including the ability of a few gatekeepers to exploit the individuals and businesses that are dependent on their platforms, to their ability to exclude and eliminate rivals. And by reinforcing surveillance advertising, further weakening business models of publishers, and making it easier to create and disseminate misinformation, AI also risks greatly magnifying many of the harms that tech monopolies have already inflicted on our public debate and on the health of our democracies. And last but not least, our growing dependence on the digital infrastructure provided by a few monopolistic platforms also threatens our resilience and our security. To cite the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Gary Gensler, our reliance on a few AI models is highly likely to trigger a financial crisis within the next decade. But fortunately, as our report makes clear, there are a whole range of actions, and as Barry mentioned as well, that we can take now to rein in the power of the tech giants over AI without necessarily passing new laws. That can include imposing new regulatory responsibilities on gatekeepers in the cloud and in foundation models, to breaking up some of the anti-competitive deals and partnerships that I was talking about, and imposing interoperability requirements across the technology stack. I won't go into more detail on those ideas now, both to avoid preempting many of the discussions that we'll be having over the course of today, but I encourage you to read about them in our report, where we go into some detail on all of these ideas. But to summarize, we have a clear monopoly problem when it comes to AI, and we can't expect it to resolve itself. But by using the extensive tools that we already have, and by working across regulatory silos to tackle AI's overlapping harms, we can loosen the grip of the tech giants and create a more democratic and inclusive future for AI.